Chapter 14 of Aircraft and Submarines by Willis J. Abbot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomcho. The Modern Submarine, Part 1. Holland and Lake must be considered the fathers of the modern submarine. This claim is not made in a spirit of patriotic boastfulness, though of course it is true that the latter was an American by birth and the former by choice, and that, therefore, we, as a nation, have a right to be proud of the accomplishments of these two fellow citizens of ours. Without wishing to detract anything from the value of the work done by many men in many countries towards the development of the submarine after and contemporaneously with Holland and Lake, it still remains true that the work which these two did formed the foundation on which all others built. To day no submarine worthy of the name, no matter where it has been built and no matter where and how it is used, is without some features which are typical of either the Holland or Lake type. In many instances, and this is true especially of submarines of the highest type and the greatest development, the most significant characteristics of the Holland and Lake boats have been combined. During the years that followed the small beginnings of Holland and Lake, vast and highly efficient organizations have been built up to continue and elaborate their work. Death claimed Mr. Holland shortly after the outbreak of the Great War, on August 12, 1914. Mr. Lake, in 1917, was still personally connected with and the guiding spirit of the extensive industrial establishments which have been created at Bridgeport, Connecticut, as a result of his inventions. He, too, surrounded himself with a corps of experts who in cooperation with him have brought the Lake submarines to a point of perfection which at the time of the Argonaut's first trip would have appeared all but impossible. Roughly speaking, the beginning of the 20th century may be called the turning point in the history of submarine invention and the beginning of the modern submarine. Although, as we have heard, various governments, especially those of France and the United States, interested themselves in the submarine question and appropriated small sums of money towards its solution previous to 1900, it was only after that year that governmental interest and influence were set to work with determination and purpose on behalf of submarine inventors. Quite naturally, this resulted in increased popular interest. Experimental work on and with submarines no longer had to rely exclusively on private capital, frequently inconveniently timid and limited, but could count now on the vast financial resources of all the great nations of the world. This also made available the unlimited intellectual resources of serious scientists in every part of the universe. Mechanical and electrical engineers, naval designers and constructors, active men of finance and business, and quiet thinkers and investigators in laboratories began to interest themselves in the further development of the submarine. The United States for a number of years after its adoption of the Holland type remained true to its first choice. Between 1900, when the first Holland boat was bought by the United States government, and 1911, all the United States submarine boats were of the Holland type. In the latter year, however, it was decided to give the Lake boat a trial, and since that time a number of boats of this type have been built. In all essential features, both the Holland and Lake boats of later days were very similar to the original boats of these two types. In all the details, however, immense progress was made. Each new boat thus became greatly superior to its predecessors. This was especially true in regard to size and speed, and the improvements made in these two respects naturally resulted in a corresponding increase in radius of activity. The passing years also brought a wonderful refinement of all the technical details of the submarine boats. Practically every feature was developed to a remarkable degree. There is, indeed, a great difference between the submarine boats of the early 20th century, which had to rely on their conning tower for steering, and more recent boats with their wonderful periscopes and gyro compasses. Similar progress was made in the development of the means of propulsion. The engines used for surface travelling became more powerful and efficient. This was also true of the electric motors, batteries, and accumulators employed in the submerged state. The problem of ventilation likewise has been worked out to such an extent that in the most modern submarines most of the inconveniences experienced by the crews of earlier boats have been removed. This perfection of technical details which was thus gradually approached also permitted a very considerable increase in the fighting power of submarine boats. The number of torpedo tubes was increased, and it became possible to carry a larger reserve stock of torpedoes. Submarines of to day furthermore carry guns varying in caliber, attaining in some instances 4 inches, and when in later years it became evident that one of the most dangerous enemies of the submarine was the airplane, some of the boats were equipped even with anti-aircraft guns. In the United States Navy the submarine has never been popular. Indeed, it is by no means certain that in comparison with other navies of the world, the United States was not better off in underwater boats in 1911 than she was 3 years later when the war cloud broke. The bulk of our naval opinion has always been for the dreadnoughts. A change of political administration at Washington in 1912 gave a temporary setback to naval development, and the submarines, being still a matter of controversy, languished. Few were built, and of those few many showed such structural weakness that the reports of their manoeuvres were either suppressed or issued in terms of such broad generality that the public could by no possibility suspect, what all the Navy knew to be the fact, that the submarine flotilla of the United States was weak to the point of impotence. Happily we had nearly 3 years in which to observe the progress of the war before becoming ourselves embroiled in it. During this period our submarine fleet was somewhat increased, and upon our actual entrance upon the struggle a feverish race was begun to put us on an equality with other nations in underwater boats. It would have been too late had any emergency arisen, but Germany had no ships afloat to be attacked by our submarines had we possessed them. Her own warfare upon our merchant shipping could not be met in kind, for submarines cannot fight submarines. We have, therefore, up to the present time, not suffered from the perilous neglect with which we long treated this form of naval weapon. Indeed, the submarine fleet of the United States Navy at the beginning of the war was so inconsiderable that foreign writers on the subject ignored it. In 1900 we had purchased 9 of the type of submarines then put out by the Holland Company. One of these, the first in actual service, known as the Baby Holland, was kept in commission 10 years, and upon becoming obsolete was honored by being taken in state to the Naval Academy at Annapolis and there mounted on a pedestal for the admiration of all comers. She was 59 feet long and would make a striking exhibit placed next to one of the new German submersible cruisers which exceed 300 feet and have a displacement of 5,000 tons. These first Holland ships, which long constituted the entire underwater force of the United States, were but trivial affairs compared with the modern vessel. Their displacement was but 122 tons. Their engines for surface navigation were of 160 horsepower, gasoline, and for underwater navigation 70 horsepower, electric. They carried but 1 torpedo tube and 2 extra torpedoes and had a radius of action of but 300 miles. At that time, in fact, the naval theory was that submarines were coast defense vessels altogether. After this war they are likely to form part of the first battle line of every navy. Yet these pioneer vessels established their seaworthiness well in 1911, when 4 of them, accompanied by a parent ship to supply them with fresh stocks of fuel and to render assistance in case of need, crossed the Pacific Ocean under their own power to the Philippines. This exploit tended to popularize these craft in the Navy Department, and soon after larger vessels known as the Viper class were ordered. One of these was called the Octopus, the first submarine to be fitted with twin screws. In many ways she represented a distinct advance in the art of submarine construction. She was in fact the first vessel built with the distinct idea of being a cruising as well as a harbor defense ship. Her type proved successful in this respect. The Octopus further established a record for deep sea submergence in 1907 when she descended to a depth of 205 feet off Boston, returning to the surface in entire safety. The ability to withstand the pressure of the water at great depths is a vital quality of a successful submarine. One American submarine narrowly escaped destruction because of structural weakness in this respect. She had by accident descended a few feet below the normal depth at which such boats navigate. The water pressure affected the valves which refused to work, and the vessel slowly sank deeper and deeper. At a recorded depth of 123 feet, the sinking of the vessel became so much more rapid that the crew with frantic endeavors sought at once to stop the leaks and pump out the water which had entered. At that depth there was a pressure of 153½ pounds upon every square inch of the surface of the submarine. This the workers at the one hand pump had to overcome. It was a savage and a desperate struggle, but the men finally won and the vessel regained the surface. As a result of this experience, every navy prescribed submergence tests for its submarines before putting them into commission. How to make these tests was perplexing at first. A government did not want to send men down in a steel casket to see just how far they could go before it collapsed. But if no observer accompanied the ship, it would be impossible to tell at what depth leakage and other signs of weakness became apparent. An Italian naval architect, Major Laurenti, whose submarines are now found in every navy of the world, invented a dock in which these tests can be made up to any desired pressure, while the observers inside the submarine are in communication with those without, and the pressure can be instantly removed if signs of danger appear. In the United States Navy, boats to be accepted must stand a pressure equivalent to that encountered at 200 feet. In the German Navy the depth prescribed is 170 feet. Under normal conditions submarines seldom travel at a depth of more than 100 feet, although the F-1 of the United States Navy accomplished the remarkable feat of making a 6-hour cruise in San Francisco Bay at a depth of 283 feet. At this depth the skin of the ship has to withstand a pressure of no less than 123 pounds per square inch. Specific information as to the nature of submarine construction in the United States since the beginning of the war in 1914 is jealously guarded by the Navy Department. In broad general terms the number of ships under construction is revealed to the public, but all information as to the size of individual vessels, their armor, or the qualities of novelty with which everyone hopes and believes American inventive genius has invested them, are kept secret. The Navy Yearbook of 1916 summarized our submarine strength at that time as follows: Submarines fit for action 42, displacement 15,722 tons. Submarines under construction 33, displacement 21,093 tons. Submarines authorized and appropriated for 30, displacement 22,590 tons. Total 105, displacement 59,405 tons. In addition, 37 more had been authorized by Congress without the appropriation of money for them. By this time, however, these appropriations have been made together with further heavy ones. While figures are refused at the Navy Department, it is declared that while the United States in 1914 was the last of the great powers in respect to submarine strength provided for, it is now well up to the foremost, even to Germany. Great Britain, like the United States, continued for many years to build submarines of the Holland type. Naturally all the recent improvements were incorporated in the British boats. Very little, however, is known concerning the details of the more recent additions to the British submarine flotilla because of the secrecy maintained by the British authorities in wartime. At the beginning of the present war, the British Navy possessed 82 active submarines of 5 different classes. They were all of the Holland type, but in each class there were incorporated vast improvements over the preceding class. Displacement, size, motive power, speed, radius of action, and armament were gradually increased until the E class contained boats possessing the following features: submerged displacement 800 tons, length 176 feet, beam 22½ feet, heavy oil engines of 2,000 horsepower, electric engines of 800 horsepower, surface speed 16 knots, submerged speed 10 knots, cruising range 5,000 miles, armament 4 torpedo tubes, space for 6 torpedoes, and 2 3-inch quick-firing, high-angle disappearing guns. armored conning towers and decks, wireless equipment, 3 panoramic periscopes. At the same time 22 other submarines were said to be in course of construction. Some of these were of the F class, Holland type, similar to the E class, except that every single characteristic had been greatly increased, in many instances even doubled. In addition to the F class Holland type boats, there were also under construction a number of boats of different types designated respectively as V, W, and S class. The V class were of the Lake type, the W of the French Laubeuf type, and the S class of the Italian Fiat or Laurenti type. Both of the last named were adaptations of the Lake type. France, which was for many years the prodigal of the nations when it came to submarine building, has continued this tendency. In a way, this liberal expenditure of money did not pay particularly well, for although it resulted in the creation of a comparatively large submarine fleet, this fleet contained boats of every kind and description. Quite a number of the boats were little more than experiments, and possessed not a great deal of practical value. The manning and efficient handling of a fleet having so little homogeneity naturally was a difficult matter and seriously restricted its fighting efficiency. At the outbreak of the war France had 92 submarines in active service, belonging to 12 different classes. In addition, there had also been built at various times 5 experimental boats which had been named Argonaut, Admiral Bourgeois, Archimede, Marriott, and Charles Brune. The majority of the boats belonging to the various classes were of the Laubeuf type, an adaptation of the Lake type made for the French Navy by M. Laubeuf, a marine engineer. In their various details these boats vary considerably. Their displacement ranges from 67 tons to 1,000 tons, their length from 100 feet to 240 feet, their beam from 12 feet to 20 feet, their surface speed from 8½ knots to 17½ knots, their submerged speed from 5 knots to 12 knots, the horsepower of their heavy oil engines from 1,300 to 2,000, and that of their electric motors from 350 to 900. Some of the boats, however, have steam engines, others gasoline motors, and still others steam turbines. The cruising range of the biggest and newest boats is 4,000 miles. Armament varies with size, of course, the latest boats carrying 4 torpedo tubes for 8 18-inch torpedoes and 2 14 PDR quick-firing, high-angle, disappearing guns. 9 more submarines were in course of construction at the outbreak of war, most of which were of the improved Gustave Zédé class. During the war French shipyards were chiefly occupied with capital navy ships, and it is not thought the submarine strength has been much increased. Of the great naval powers, Germany was, strangely enough, the last to become interested in the building of a submarine fleet. This, however, was not due to any neglect on the part of the German naval authorities. It is quite evident from the few official records which are available that they watched and studied very carefully the development of the submarine and growth of the various submarine fleets. During the early years of the 20th century, however, the Germans seemed to think that most of the boats that were being built then had not yet passed through the experimental stage, and they also apparently decided that it would be just as well to wait until other nations had spent their money and efforts on those quasi-experimental boats. Not until submarines had been built in the United States, England, and France, which had proved beyond all doubt that they were practicable vessels of definite accomplishments, did the Germans seriously concern themselves with the creation of a German submarine fleet. When this period had been reached they went ahead with full power, and with the usual German thoroughness they adopted the best points from each of the various types developed by that time. The result of this attitude was a submarine boat built at first exclusively by Krupp, and known as the Germania type. It was this type which formed the basis of the German submarine, which has become known so extensively and disastrously during recent years. In most respects this type is perhaps more similar to the Lake type than to any other, although some features of the Holland type have been incorporated as well. At the beginning of the war, Germany was credited with only 30 submarines. 6 more were then rapidly approaching completion, and the German naval law passed some time before provided for the building of 72 submarines by the end of 1917. It is believed, in fact, that by that time the Germans had not less than 200 Unterseeboots. From the very beginning the Germans have designated their submarines by the letter U, standing for Unterseeboot, followed by numbers. Their first boat was built in 1905 and was named U-1. It was a comparatively small boat of 236 tons displacement. The motive power on the surface was a heavy oil engine of 250 horsepower. Under water the boat was driven by electric motors of a little more than 100 horsepower. Submerged, the UN was capable of a speed of 7 knots only, which on the surface of the water could be increased to 10. Her radius of action was about 750 miles. Only 1 torpedo tube had been provided. From this boat to the modern German submarine was indeed a long step taken in a comparatively short time. Not very much is known regarding modern German submarines, but the latest boats completed before the war were vessels of 900 tons displacement with heavy oil engines of 2,000 horsepower, and electric motors of 900 horsepower, possessing a surface and submerged speed of 18 and 10 knots respectively and a cruising radius of 4,000 miles. They had 4 torpedo tubes for 8 torpedoes, 2 14 PDR quick-firing guns, and 2 1 PDR high-angle anti-aircraft guns. Naturally, they were also equipped with all the latest improvements, such as wireless apparatus, panoramic periscopes, armored conning towers, and decks. Since the outbreak of the war the Germans have built even more powerful submarine boats whose perfections in regard to speed, radius of action, and armament became known through their accomplishments. Of these we will hear more in a later chapter. At just what period of the war the Germans woke up to the vital importance to them of an enormous submarine fleet is not known. It may have been immediately upon the amazing exploit of Captain Wettingen in the North Sea. At any rate, the war had not long progressed before the destruction caused by German submarine attacks began to awaken the apprehension of the Allies and neutral nations. Retaliation in kind was impossible. The Germans had neither merchant nor naval ships at sea to be sunk. The rapidity with which the volume of the loss inflicted upon merchant shipping grew indicated an equally rapid increase in the size of the German underwater fleet. Neutrals were enraged by the extension by the Germans of the area of sea in which they claimed the right to sink neutral ships, and their growing disregard for the restraining principles of international law. How greatly they developed the submarine idea was shown by their construction in 1916 of vessels with a displacement of 2,400 tons, a length of 279 feet, and a beam of 26 feet. A surface speed of 22 knots, cruising radius of 6,500 miles, mounting 4 to 8 guns, and carrying a crew of from 40 to 60. But it was reported that 2 vessels designed primarily for surface cruising, but nevertheless submersible at will, had been laid down of 5,000 tons, a length of 414 feet, and a radius of 18,000 to 20,000 miles. These submersible cruisers, as they were called, mounted 6 to 8 guns, 30 torpedo tubes, and carried 90 torpedoes. What part vessels of this type shall play in war is still to be determined. End of The Modern Submarine, Part 1. Recording by William Tomcho.